So in Market Socialism as a Form of Life, I subject the standard proposals for a market socialist alternative to capitalism to a main concept for analyzing the kind of thing that capitalism is. So market socialism is presented and argued for as a replacement for capitalism. And the guiding idea of the paper is that it ought to be assessed, those proposals ought to be assessed and evaluated according to the kind of social ontology that capitalism has, which is to say, under the named in the title of the paper, capitalism is a form of life. So if we're defending market socialism as such a replacement, we should analyze it in terms appropriate to a form of life. And the argument that I make in the paper is that forms of life are composed of social practices. They are ensembles of social practices, and the practices encode values and valuations. The values and valuations give rise to reasons for action and belief, operative reasons, not normative reasons, but motivating reasons. And for a form of life to be habitable in the sense of able to reproduce itself over time and respond to and adjust its structure to the problems that it encounters, both problems that it creates and problems that simply occur to it or within it, the core institutions, the core social practices at the center of that form of life have to be coherent with one another. That means the reasons that stem from the values they encode can't be incompossible or starkly conflicting. And this is a problem, of course, for capitalism itself as a form of life in relation to political principles of political democracy, for example. And the argument that I make in the paper is that market socialist replacements, proposed replacements for capitalism, also have this problem of structural tension between the core practices that define it as a proposed form of life, market practices on one hand, and the socialist practices of political order on the other. And that existing defenses of market socialism do not adequately address that issue. They don't adequately inform us and explain how it is that the market practices that are defended on economic efficiency and freedom enhancing grounds can comport with the political practices that would be needed under socialism to keep capital out of private hands and under public administration. So that most market socialist proposals end up being really two arguments yoked together, one for the independent virtues and functions of markets, and another for the independent political virtues and functions of socialist political order. But they need to be able to show how these could be integrated with one another into one self-continuous form of life, because that's the kind of thing that these proposals are proposals for. And that we have reason to think that they cannot, at least insofar as they've presented so far, be integrated in that way. And I think ultimately the value of the paper lies in connecting results in different areas of research: political theory and the theory of political order, the philosophy of economics, social ontology and critical theory, what are social practices and how do they work, and practical normativity. How do we reason together on the basis of the values that our practices encode? So that's what I would say is the ultimate upshot. Yeah, so I think it's relevant in a scholarly or academic way, in that it brings to bear a different set of questions about the relationship between economic relations of production, power, command, and socialization, and political practices of solidarity, community, mutual concern, and so on, that are really often treated distinctly and under different rubrics of analysis and different criterial standards of assessing the arguments for within those different domains. And so I think that, you know, there has been a disjunct between the kind of critical theoretic analysis of capitalism as a social formation and the normative political philosophy, liberal egalitarian, analytic Marxist areas of political philosophy which critique existing capitalist social relations on different grounds. And these often do not overlap at all, and they don't really talk to each other. And so I think the scholarly virtue of the paper, I hope, is that it puts these two lines of critique into dialogue with one another and shows that there are significant tensions that need to be worked out if what it is that we are proposing, what it is that the defenders of these arguments are advancing, are really to be lived and enacted in actual social life. And I think the broader relevance is the broader social relevance of the paper and the ideas that the paper talks about really concerns, you know, how it is. I mean, you know, plenty of people in common life recognize that there are serious problems with our current political and economic order. And what I think the value of the paper directs us to is we need a way of translating our thinking and our reflections about those problems into thinking and reflections about other problems that affect society, in terms of how it is that we live in general, our leisure practices, our familial practices, the way in which we organize different aspects of life that are not narrowly economic or narrowly political, but that hold the economic and the political practices also in conjunction with one another, that they compose a kind of totality in which each element has a functional position relative to the other elements. We have to start thinking about the way the totality hangs together in a more systematic way. And so I think that's another virtue that goes beyond just the scholarly point of the paper. Yeah, so I think some further avenues of research, one in particular, I think, is research into practical normativity, our normative reasons and our motivating reasons, how these have purchase on human decision-making, collective decision-making, individual autonomy, and so on. There's a lot of great work being done in philosophy, of course, on these topics. And I think that one way into the future is to connect our analysis of normative reasons with the ways in which reasons become motivating for us, how they are connected to and arise out of the valuations that we make, and the place of those valuations in the structure of actually existing social arrangements. So it's one thing to talk about what makes a normative reason action guiding for someone. It's another to see how it is that it arises from values that don't simply float free platonically, as it were, but are encoded already have to be encoded into a way of going about a particular social practice. And I think so. I think that's one main avenue of research. And I also think, in general, looking at proposals for the amendment of our existing economic structure have to look outside of just the conditions of production, exchange, and consumption to the broader forms of human organization, the broader ways of living individual lives that these are connected to. So it's one thing to argue that workplaces have to be democratized, for example, and that they have to be democratized everywhere. But you also have to look at how it is that people would have to live differently in order for that transformation to be materially instituted in a real social formation. And so I think there's a lot of work left to be done on questions like that.